Picture this for a second. A father raises a blade to his daughter's throat. She's struggling, crying through a gag, her eyes wide with confusion and terror. He doesn't look away. He doesn't hesitate. With one brutal motion, Agamemnon, the High King of Greece, slaughters his own child, Iphigenia, on a stone altar. He doesn't do it for justice. He doesn't even do it for revenge. He does it for wind. For weeks, his fleet has been trapped at Aulis, 1,000 ships, tens of thousands of warriors, and not a single breeze to carry them toward Troy. The sea is glass. The sails hang limp. The army grows restless. According to the seers, the gods demand payment, a life for a wind. Agamemnon pays it. As Iphigenia's blood spills across the stone, the air shifts. A current rolls in. The sails snap tight. The army erupts in cheers. And just like that, the Trojan War begins. Not with glory, but with the murder of a teenage girl. We remember Achilles' rage. We remember Helen's beauty. But we rarely stop to think about the road to Troy, paved with the blood of a daughter sacrificed by her own father. Now, before we dive deeper into the survival, betrayal, and brutality that followed, if you're drawn to the hidden realities behind the legends, consider liking the video and subscribing. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible to think that we're unpacking a 3,000-year-old war together, connected across continents by curiosity. The sacrifice worked. The wind roared back to life. 1,000 black ships carved across the Aegean Sea. Agamemnon buried whatever guilt he felt beneath command and ambition, leading the largest invasion force the Bronze Age had ever seen. But when the coastline of Troy finally appeared on the horizon, something strange happened. The ships scraped against the sand of the Troad. The ramps didn't drop. The oarsmen froze. A rumor had spread through the ranks like poison. The first Greek to step on Trojan soil will die. Imagine it. Achilles, Ajax, Odysseus, the deadliest warriors in the known world, standing there, paralyzed by superstition. On the beach, the Trojans waited, weapons drawn, mocking them. The silence stretched. The invasion stalled before a single blow was struck. Then one man moved. A prince named Protesilaus didn't wait for orders. He vaulted over the side of his ship and crashed into the surf. Shield raised, spear ready. He sprinted up the sand and drove bronze into flesh. One Trojan fell, then another. He fought like a man who already knew his fate. Seconds later, a spear, some say thrown by Hector himself, pierced his chest. Protesilaus collapsed into the sand, fulfilling the prophecy instantly, but his death shattered the paralysis. The Greeks poured from their ships like a tidal wave. Bronze slammed into bronze. Shields splintered. The beach ran red. And in the chaos, the memory of Iphigenia's sacrifice faded beneath the roar of battle. The Greeks secured their foothold. The Trojans retreated behind their towering walls. They had arrived. And as the invaders stared up at the citadel of Troy, a sobering truth settled in. They had sacrificed a daughter and a hero just to reach the front door. The real slaughter hadn't even started. Now let's peel back the poetry for a moment. Homer sings about a stolen queen, but archaeology tells a colder story. The Trojan War wasn't just about Helen. It was about control, specifically control of trade. Troy, known in Hittite records as Wilusa, sat at the mouth of the Dardanelles. This narrow strait connected the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, and the geography created a natural bottleneck. Strong currents and unpredictable winds forced Bronze Age ships to wait in Troy's harbor before they could push upstream. And while they waited, they paid. The Trojan kings taxed cargo. sold supplies, controlled passage. They grew rich, not through conquest, but through position. Troy was less a city and more a toll booth at the center of the ancient world. To the warlords across the Aegean, it wasn't just a rival, it was a vault. Now look at the men who came to crack it open. Forget philosophers in white robes debating democracy. That's 8 centuries later. Mycenaean Greece, around 1200 BC, was something else entirely. These men were the Vikings of the Mediterranean. They lived inside massive citadels built from stones so enormous that later generations believed only cyclopes could have moved them. Their society was rigid, hierarchical. At the top sat the Wanax, the warrior king, whose power depended on one thing: his ability to distribute plunder. Their art tells the story. They didn't paint peaceful landscapes. They painted hunts, boar tusk helmets, tower shields, war. When trade slowed or a neighbor looked too prosperous, Mycenaean ships launched. They were predators, and across the water, they saw the richest prey of all. The abduction of Helen, whether she went willingly or not, gave them the perfect excuse. In a culture obsessed with time, honor, and reputation, Paris hadn't just taken a wife, he had humiliated a king. Agamemnon used that insult masterfully. He rallied the fractured Mycenaean warlords with a promise that satisfied both their code of honor and their hunger for Trojan gold. But Troy wasn't defenseless. It was tied into the Anatolian world, backed by treaties with the powerful Hittite Empire. Its walls, what archaeologists call Troy 6 and 7a, were engineering masterpieces. Limestone blocks angled inward to resist earthquakes and frustrate attackers. Deep wells inside the citadel meant they could survive a siege for years. This was not going to be quick. On one side, a coalition of pirate kings desperate for wealth as the Bronze Age teetered toward collapse. On the other, a fortified merchant city controlling the artery of the ancient world. When the Greeks saw those walls up close, reality hit hard. They couldn't storm them. The defenses were too strong, so they dug in. The beach became a sprawling slum of tents, livestock, stolen goods, and captives. They raided surrounding villages for food, women, and animals, carving out a ring of devastation that stretched for miles. This wasn't a noble duel for love. It became a grinding war of attrition. The Greeks couldn't get in. The Trojans couldn't drive them out. For nearly a decade, the most advanced killing machines of their time faced off in a brutal stalemate, slowly wearing each other down while the wider Bronze Age world began to fracture and burn, and the worst was still ahead. When we think about the Trojan War, we picture 10 straight years of warriors battering the main gates. But that's not how Bronze Age siege warfare worked. For the first 9 years, the walls of Troy remained largely untouched. The Greeks quickly realized brute force wouldn't crack Wilusa, so they changed strategy. Instead of smashing into the city, they turned outward and unleashed devastation on everything around it. The Greek army was enormous, 50,000 men, thousands of horses. They needed food every single day: grain, meat, wine, and they weren't importing supplies from home. They stole them. Under Achilles' command, the Myrmidons became a roaming strike force. Homer tells us Achilles sacked 12 cities by sea and 11 by land. That doesn't mean glorious duels in open fields. It means liquidation. Towns allied with Troy, places like Lyrnessus and Thebe, were wiped out. The men were killed, the women enslaved, livestock driven back to the beach, storehouses emptied. It fed the army, and it slowly strangled Troy by cutting off its allies. This brings us to the darkest currency of the Bronze Age: human beings. Today, we focus on Helen. But she was just one woman. Thousands of others paid for this war. During the sack of Lyrnessus, Achilles killed the king and the husband of a woman named Briseis. Then he claimed her as his war prize. She became property, a trophy displayed in his tent. In another raid, the Greeks captured Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo. She was awarded to Agamemnon. These two women, Briseis and Chryseis, would ignite the greatest crisis of the war. In Mycenaean warrior culture, honor wasn't abstract. It was physical. You could count it. Gold, weapons, tripods, women. To take a man's prize was to strip him of status. By year 9, the Greek camp had rotted into something ugly. It was less a military base and more a sprawling shantytown packed with stolen goods and traumatized captives. Dysentery soaked the sand. Flies swarmed. The heat was relentless. The soldiers were tired. They had come for glory. Instead, they had spent nearly a decade raiding villages and watching friends die. Inside Troy, pressure was building too. The city itself was secure, but every village that burned meant one less ally. Hector, prince of Troy and commander of its forces, watched smoke rise from the countryside, knowing his coalition was bleeding out. The stalemate couldn't last forever, and the spark that broke it didn't come from a sword. It came from a microscopic enemy. An old priest of Apollo entered the Greek camp carrying ransom for his daughter, Chryseis. He begged Agamemnon to return her. Agamemnon refused, not politely, not diplomatically. He humiliated the old man and threatened his life. The priest left in tears and prayed to his god for vengeance. Then the dying began. In Homer's telling, Apollo descends like nightfall, firing invisible arrows into the camp. First the animals fall, then the men. Strip away the divine language and you see the reality. After 9 years, 50,000 men and thousands of animals were living in filth with no sanitation system. Rotting garbage, contaminated water, fleas, rats. The arrows were likely plague, typhoid, dysentery, maybe even early bubonic infection. Funeral pyres burned day and night. Smoke choked the camp. The army was collapsing from within. Desperation forced action. Achilles, furious that his men were dying not from battle but from fever and vomit, called an assembly. That alone was provocative. Only Agamemnon had the authority to summon council. This was more than concern. It was a challenge. In front of coughing soldiers and drifting ash, the seer Calchas revealed the truth. Apollo was punishing them because Agamemnon had dishonored his priest. The plague would end only if Chryseis was returned. Agamemnon knew it was true, but admitting fault in front of rival kings, that was political suicide. So he lashed out. Fine, he said. He would return the girl. But if he lost his prize, he would take another. He would not be seen as lesser, and he chose the most dangerous target possible. He chose Achilles. He demanded Briseis. This wasn't a lover's spat. It was a public humiliation. In the value system of the Iliad, to take Achilles' prize was to strip him of honor in front of the entire army. Achilles' hand drifted to his sword. For a moment, he considered killing Agamemnon on the spot. Imagine that alternate history. The Trojan War ending in civil war on the beach. Instead, Achilles chose something more devastating. He chose absence. He swore he would not fight. He would sit by his ships and watch the Greeks suffer. Let them learn what they were worth without him. Agamemnon called the bluff. His heralds went to Achilles' tent and took Briseis. Achilles let her go. and then he withdrew. The consequences were immediate. The Myrmidons, his elite troops, laid down their spears. On the walls of Troy, sentries noticed. Achilles' banner was gone. Hector saw opportunity. For 9 years, the Trojans had avoided open battle with Achilles. Now their greatest threat was neutralized. The gates opened. The Trojan army surged onto the plain. What followed was chaos. Bronze Age warfare wasn't disciplined shield walls like you'd see centuries later in Sparta or Rome. It was personal, violent, a swirling brawl of individual combat. Bronze swords bent on impact. Warriors had to stop mid-fight and straighten blades underfoot. Spears were the primary killers. Heavy shafts tipped with leaf-shaped bronze designed to punch through linen armor and boar-tusk helmets. Chariots acted as taxis for aristocrats, rushing them into combat, pulling them out when things turned. In the dust and screaming, Paris stepped forward. Yes, that Paris, leopard skin over his shoulders, bow in hand, a weapon many heavy infantry considered cowardly. He challenged the Greeks. Menelaus accepted instantly. The king of Sparta saw the man who had eaten at his table and stolen his wife. The duel revealed everything. Paris threw first. His spear bounced harmlessly off Menelaus's shield. Menelaus hurled his own. It tore through Paris's armor, barely missing his ribs. The Spartan smashed his sword against Paris's helmet and lunged barehanded, grabbing the horsehair crest and dragging the prince toward the Greek lines. Paris was seconds from death. In myth, Aphrodite rescues him in a cloud of mist. In reality, maybe the straps snapped. Maybe Trojan allies intervened. Either way, Paris fled. He retreated to his chambers while others bled for his vanity. The truce collapsed, and with Achilles still sulking, a new force emerged. Diomedes, young, aggressive, entering what the Greeks called Aristeia, a state of battlefield brilliance that bordered on madness. He rampaged through Trojan ranks. When struck by an arrow, he ripped it out and kept fighting. Homer says he wounded gods. Translated into reality, he fought with such ferocity that he seemed unstoppable. While Paris perfumed himself inside the palace, Diomedes was knee-deep in blood, keeping the Greek army from collapse. The message was clear. This war would not be won by pretty princes. It would be won by men willing to drown in it. The war reached the ships. Hector, pressing the advantage, smashed through the Greek defensive wall and set fire to a galley. Flames licked up the stern. The smell of burning pitch carried across the beach. If the ships went up, the Greeks were finished. No retreat, no escape, just annihilation. Achilles watched the smoke from his tent. He did nothing, but Patroclus, his closest companion, the one man who could speak to him without fear, couldn't stand it anymore. He begged Achilles for permission to enter the fight. Not as himself, but wearing Achilles' armor. The mere sight of that legendary silhouette might terrify the Trojans into retreat. Achilles agreed, with a warning. Push them back from the ships. Do not pursue them to the walls. Patroclus promised, and then he broke that promise. Clad in Achilles' armor, he led the Myrmidons into battle. The Trojans faltered at the sight. Momentum shifted. Patroclus drove them across the plain, cutting down warriors in a surge of adrenaline and borrowed glory. He even killed Sarpedon, a major Trojan ally. He forgot he wasn't Achilles. He forgot he was mortal. High on victory, he charged toward the gates of Troy itself. There in the chaos, his luck vanished. His helmet was knocked free. He was dazed by a blow from behind, exposed. Hector saw his chance. He drove his spear into Patroclus's belly and stripped the magnificent armor from his body. When word reached Achilles, something inside him snapped. He didn't cry quietly. He collapsed into the dirt, clawing at the ground, pouring ash over his head, releasing a scream so raw it was said to terrify horses on the battlefield. The anger that followed wasn't hot. It was cold. Agamemnon didn't matter anymore. Briseis didn't matter. Pride didn't matter. Only Hector. Achilles reconciled with Agamemnon, not out of forgiveness, but impatience. He needed to fight. When he returned to the field, he didn't wage war, he conducted slaughter. He cut down Trojans so relentlessly that in Homer's telling, he clogged the river Scamander with corpses. The river itself rose in protest. The Trojan army broke and fled back behind their walls, all but one. Hector stood alone outside the Scaean gates. From the walls, his parents begged him to come inside. But Hector was trapped by his own code. He had led this defense. He would not hide. Yet when he saw Achilles approaching, new armor gleaming, forged by Hephaestus, his courage faltered. He ran. 3 times they circled the city walls, Achilles relentless, Hector gasping, sweat and fear mixing with dust. Finally, Hector stopped. He turned to face death and proposed a pact. Whoever won would return the other's body for proper burial. Achilles looked at him with empty eyes. There are no pacts between lions and men. He recognized the armor Hector wore. It had been his. He knew exactly where to strike. His spear pierced the weak point at the neck. Hector fell, and what came next crossed a sacred line. In the Bronze Age, you respected the body of a fallen enemy. Achilles didn't. He pierced Hector's ankles, threaded straps through the tendons, tied the corpse to his chariot, and dragged it through the dust, while the royal family watched from the walls. The hero had become something else. With Hector dead, you might expect Troy to collapse. It didn't. It called for help. First came the Amazons, led by Queen Penthesilea, then Memnon of Ethiopia. For brief moments, they pushed the Greeks back. Then they met Achilles. He killed them both. He seemed unstoppable, until he wasn't. Achilles chased the Trojans too close to the walls, alone, exposed. Up above, Paris nocked an arrow. Myth says Apollo guided it to his heel. The later story of the river Styx is poetic invention. But sever the calcaneal tendon, the Achilles tendon, and even the greatest warrior cannot stand. The arrow immobilized him. The fastest runner in the Greek army suddenly pinned to the earth. Archers closed in. Achilles did not die in a glorious duel. He died in the dust, struck down by a bow, the weapon he despised, fired by the man he respected least. His death left a vacuum, and it destroyed Ajax. Ajax the Great had carried Achilles' body from the field, while Odysseus defended the retreat. By every traditional measure of honor, Achilles' divine armor should have been his. But the Greeks held a vote. Ajax, the embodiment of brute strength. Odysseus, the master of strategy and speech. Odysseus won. The old code was shifting. Muscle no longer ruled alone. Ajax couldn't accept it. Humiliation festered. That night, something broke inside him. Legend blames Athena. We might call it trauma and rage. He stormed into the darkness to kill his rivals. By morning, the madness cleared. He stood surrounded not by kings, but by slaughtered sheep. He had hacked apart livestock, believing them to be Agamemnon and Odysseus. The shame was unbearable. Ajax planted his sword in the sand, the very blade once gifted to him by Hector, and fell upon it. Now Achilles was dead. Ajax was dead. 10 years of war, and Troy still stood. Force had failed. Politics had failed. It was time for deception. One morning, the Trojans looked out from their walls. The beach was empty. The Greek tents were burned. The ships were gone. All that remained was a massive wooden structure, dedicated, so it seemed, to Athena. The Trojans dragged it inside. They celebrated, drank, sang. For the first time in a decade, the nightmare appeared over. Then midnight came. Smoke crept through the air, not incense, burning wood. Then the sound, not a battle cry. Just the wet, rhythmic thud of bronze entering flesh. The gates were open. Whether it was a literal hollow horse filled with soldiers, a siege engine disguised in hides, or even an earthquake cracking the walls, the result was the same. The Greek fleet had returned under cover of darkness. This was not battle. It was extermination. House to house, room to room. Men stabbed in their beds. Women dragged into the streets. The narrow alleys became death traps. At the palace, Neoptolemus, Achilles' teenage son, found King Priam clinging to an altar. In the ancient world, you did not kill a man at an altar. Neoptolemus did. He butchered the old king on sacred stone. And then came the image that defines the fall of Troy. Astyanax, Hector's infant son. As long as he lived, Troy's bloodline endured. The Greeks took him from his mother. They didn't use a blade. They carried him to the highest point of the wall and threw him off. By sunrise, Troy 7a was a smoking ruin. The men were dead. The women bound for slavery, the gold stripped, the walls toppled. Victory tasted like ash. And it didn't end there. The gods, if you believe the myths, were disgusted by what the Greeks had done. Storms scattered the fleet. The nostoi, the homecomings, were disasters. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae expecting triumph. Instead, his wife Clytemnestra, who had never forgiven him for sacrificing Iphigenia, murdered him in his bath. Odysseus wandered for another 10 years, losing every man he commanded before crawling home alone. Zoom out further, and the pattern grows darker. Around 1200 BC, the same era Troy burned, the palaces of Greece collapsed. Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae, destroyed. The linear B tablets fall silent. The Bronze Age collapse was underway. The war that was supposed to bring wealth may have accelerated apocalypse. The victors didn't build an empire. They inherited ruins. Writing vanished. Monumental architecture ceased. Greece entered a dark age lasting centuries. For 3,000 years, Troy lived only in poetry, until a man named Heinrich Schliemann arrived in Turkey with a shovel and an obsession. He dug into a mound called Hisarlik. He used dynamite. He destroyed layers of history in search of Homer's city. And though he misdated what he found, he proved something crucial. Troy was real. Archaeologists later identified multiple cities stacked atop each other. And one layer, Troy 7a, dated to around 1180 BC, showed signs of siege. Crowded homes, buried storage jars, arrowheads, burn layers, unburied skeletons in the streets. A city attacked, a city burned. So was there a Trojan War? Almost certainly. But it wasn't a decade-long duel for the world's most beautiful woman. It was likely a brutal series of conflicts over trade, fought by desperate men at the end of an age. Homer turned that history into something larger, a meditation on pride, rage, honor, and loss. Because in the end, Achilles and Hector are the same. Meat for the dogs. The wind still moves across the ruins of Hisarlik. The bronze has corroded. The gold sits in museums. But the story remains. As long as men send other men to die for pride and profit, the Trojan War is never truly over.